In the summer of 1972, a comedian walked onto a stage in Milwaukee and said 7 words out loud. He did not threaten anyone. He did not incite a riot. He told jokes. The United States government almost treated them like a national threat. 2 hours later, he was in handcuffs. And that was just the beginning of what those 7 words would cost. George Carlin had been building toward this moment for years. He started out clean. Ed Sullivan approved. The kind of comedian who wore a suit and kept his material safe enough for primetime television. But by the late 1960s, Carlin had burned that version of himself down. He grew his hair out, dropped the tie, and started saying the things he actually thought. He stopped performing for audiences who wanted to feel comfortable. He started performing for audiences who wanted to feel challenged. His crowds loved it. The institutions that controlled American broadcasting did not. In 1972, Carlin recorded a monologue called 7 Words You Can Never Say on Television. The premise was simple. He listed 7 specific words and spent 12 minutes examining why American society had decided that these particular sounds were too dangerous to broadcast. The words themselves were not new. People said them every day in every city in the country. But on television or radio, they were forbidden. Carlin found this fascinating, and he found it worth attacking. The routine was a comedy act. It was also a direct challenge to the institutions that believed they should decide what Americans were allowed to hear. He performed it live at Milwaukee's Summerfest that July. A complaint was filed with local authorities. Carlin was arrested and charged with violating obscenity laws. The case was eventually dismissed, with the court ruling that his language was indecent but not obscene, and that he had the right to use those words in performance as long as he did not cause a public disturbance. Carlin walked free. He even renamed the routine the Milwaukee 7 as a joke at the city's expense. But the bit had now been officially flagged. It had a legal history attached to it, and somewhere in the country, someone was paying very close attention. On October 30, 1973, at 2 in the afternoon, a New York radio station called WBAI broadcast a recording of a George Carlin monologue called Filthy Words. The station aired a warning before playing it, noting that the content contained language some listeners might find offensive. The recording was a follow-up to the 7 Words routine, covering the same list with the same themes, and extending into a longer examination of how society polices language. It was broadcast as part of a program exploring society's complicated relationship with taboo speech. A man named John Douglas was driving that afternoon with his 15-year-old son. Douglas was not an ordinary listener. He was an active member of an organization called Morality in Media, a national watchdog group dedicated to fighting what it considered harmful and indecent content on public airwaves. When the Carlin recording came through his car radio in the middle of the afternoon, Douglas pulled over. He listened. Then he went home and drafted a formal letter to the Federal Communications Commission, detailing exactly what he had heard and demanding that the agency take action against the station that had aired it. We're still building comedy gold era around the moments, people, and accidents that change comedy forever. If you'd like to be part of it, subscribe below. His complaint was specific. He argued that broadcasting this material during afternoon hours, when children were likely to be listening, was a direct violation of FCC regulations governing indecent content. The FCC agreed. In February 1975, after months of investigation, the agency issued a declaratory order against the Pacifica Foundation, which owned WBAI. The order did not impose a financial penalty, but it placed a formal warning on Pacifica's record, threatening serious consequences if additional complaints were received. The message was clear: clean it up or risk losing the license to broadcast entirely. For the first time, a comedy routine had helped create a federal standard for what Americans were allowed to hear on public airwaves. Pacifica fought back. The foundation argued that the FCC had no right to regulate speech that was not legally obscene, and that the agency's action amounted to government censorship of constitutionally protected expression. The case moved into the federal courts. In 1977, the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia ruled 2-1 in Pacifica's favor. One judge called the FCC's order outright censorship. Another said the agency's definition of indecency was so loosely constructed that it could be used to swallow the First Amendment entirely. For a moment, it looked like the First Amendment had survived the test. Then the FCC appealed directly to the Supreme Court. The case that landed before the justices was called Federal Communications Commission versus Pacifica Foundation. But everyone in the legal community understood what it was really about. Could the United States government determine which words Americans were permitted to hear on public airwaves? Could a comedian's routine, performed without a victim, dismissed by a court as not legally obscene, be used to give a federal agency authority over broadcast content across the entire country? The answer the court gave would shape American media for the next half-century. In July 1978, the Supreme Court handed down its decision. It was a 5-4 ruling. The FCC prevailed. The majority opinion, written by Justice John Paul Stevens, held that broadcast media occupied a unique and special position in American life. It entered people's homes without invitation. It was freely accessible to children at any hour. Therefore, the government had a legitimate interest in regulating indecent content during hours when children were likely to be in the audience. The ruling effectively pushed controversial speech into late-night broadcasting, and it permanently changed how American radio and television handled language for decades afterward. The 4 dissenting justices were not quiet about what they believed had just happened. Justice William Brennan called the majority's reasoning a fundamental misapplication of First Amendment principles. He argued that the decision handed the government authority to impose the values of one cultural group onto every American who used the public airwaves. He was right that the ruling would not hold still. In the decades that followed, the boundaries it established were challenged repeatedly. Howard Stern built a career on testing them. The 2004 Super Bowl halftime show collapsed them momentarily. Bono saying a single word live at the Golden Globes triggered a congressional response. Every time, the thread led back to 7 words in the case they had created. Carlin watched all of it from the outside. He never changed his position. Language cannot hurt people, he said. The words themselves were never the danger. The danger was giving institutions the authority to decide which language the public was allowed to hear. He described the Supreme Court ruling as one of the worst outcomes connected to his work. Not because it affected his career, which continued without interruption, but because it gave the government a legal instrument it had been searching for since the first broadcast tower went up. He died in 2008. By then, FCC versus Pacifica Foundation had become standard material in communications law courses and First Amendment seminars at universities across the country. Carlin once said he took a strange and specific pride in that. He called himself a footnote to American judicial history. But footnotes carry weight. The case is still cited in legal arguments today. The safe harbor framework is still in place, and the 7 words that started all of it remain, in specific broadcast contexts, on the list of things the government has decided you are not allowed to say. One man filed 1 complaint from a car he had pulled over on the side of a road. That was all it took. From that moment forward, the government had a legal framework for deciding which words Americans were allowed to hear. A comedian made a joke about language.